Appreciate everyone coming today. My name is Mark Warner, and I'm going to discuss lessons learned successfully commercializing advanced biotechnologies. So notice I say biotechnologies, a lot of these, and this actually goes well with those who listened to the previous version. That's kind of the front end of developing an industrial microbe. Most of what I focused on over roughly the last 10 years is taking those technologies and commercializing them. So let me give you a little bit of my perspective. Where does it come from? So when I talk about these lessons learned, I published a series recently on it about the top 10 lessons I learned. And those came from really over the last 10 years working and spending about a little over $500 million commercializing advanced biotechnologies. This has included phototrophic algae, heterotrophic algae, biodiesel, ethanol, cellulosic ethanol, biochemicals, and food. So pretty much most of the platforms you'll see out there today. I've worked for 20 different companies roughly in the industry, and you'll see a handful of names here, most of them some of the larger entities in what I'll call the emerging biotech space. So I kind of want to share kind of generalities of what I've learned as far as commercializing those technologies. Now, one thing I want to focus on, since we're talking these emerging technologies, most of these are smaller, more modern startup type companies. So the first thing I like to talk about is building the team. I'm going to talk about a lot of the technical side in a minute, but it's very important in these small startups to focus on building the team. Generally, and I can tell you having worked at a lot of them, they're generally kind of an eclectic mix of academia and industry, petrochemicals and food and other things. And what I like to tell people is no experience is good, no experience is bad. I can remember I started in biofuels, and everyone, when the petrochemical guys would come in, oh, petrochemicals, they don't know what we're doing. Everyone comes in with a good experience. It's whether you can apply what you know or you just try and get it to fit the way you've done it previously. So I do think it's very important to bring broad perspectives in, especially when you're building a first-of-a-kind technology. I should have pointed that out. These 10 years I've been focusing, every one of these plants was the first time this technology had been taken at a commercial scale. So diverse teams also. Having worked in most of my work, I live in Sacramento, but I've worked for startup companies in the Bay Area. Generally, most of these startups, I'm pretty much about as old as it gets in these startups. Most of the CEOs of the companies I deal with are probably 35 or under. Most come out of Berkeley or Stanford. Very brilliant people, but they come with a certain perspective. Very diverse from around the world. Last company I worked at, over the half the company was on H-1 visas coming into the country, just because when you get in biotech, the best and the brightest are often not located here. So it's very diverse culturally, it's very diverse technically, and it's important, one, to embrace that, but learn how to integrate it. The other thing that's hard is I represent more the back end of the technology. I started with Monsanto about 30 years ago. I started my career in fine chemicals, went into more engineering and a focus in biotech and manufacturing. So I come from what I would consider the more manufacturing and engineering side of the industry. So because of that, in early stage startups, most people are research oriented. A lot of PhDs, a lot of R&D focus. As you get towards commercialization, one thing these companies can struggle with is the companies can change. You have a much more production focus. If you think about it, what makes an R&D person want to come to work every day? Doing something different, discovering things is different than manufacturing, where once you've set your production process, you want to do the same thing over and over and make a quality product. So these are things that can change over time. Flexibility is critical in these startup environments. Things are going to come at you and change daily. Your ability to respond to those changes is very critical. And the other thing I like to point out to people, not everyone's cut out for these environments. Where it's not working, I strongly encourage companies to make a change. So let's talk about the more technical side. My second lesson revolves around process development. And what I like to focus on is what's important is for these companies, you have to focus on the whole process. Most of these companies, similar to the group that was talking before me, they'll have a microbe they discover, so that's their core technology. Maybe it's a microbe they're going to ferment. But there's a recovery process that comes behind that to make a saleable product. They often want to focus more on their own core technology than the overall process, and that's often a mistake. As I've done a fair amount of publication recently, I've tried to take these 10 years in the industry and quite honestly get a lot of technical information out there. Not a lot of people in the advanced biotech industry understand what it takes to design, build, deploy a plant and make a money-making manufacturing operation. So as I've published a lot, since I deal with so many startups and I'm under so many non-disclosures, I wanted to give real-world examples, so I ended up developing my own mythical process. It's what I call the dimethyl glop process. And I did that so I could give, I'm going to show you some materials later, I've actually developed cost estimates and other things for it just to show it, but it's actually a mythical process. So what I say is, it's fermentation of a genetically modified organism. It's clarification through a centrifuge, then crystallizing out the dimethyl glop, drying it, and packaging it. When you deal with a lot of these companies, they want to spend 80% of their effort on the fermentation, their core technology, the front end, and they'll look at the downstream recovery and say, oh, it's not that complicated, it's more traditional. I would tell you, based on my experience, that recovery section of the plant will be every bit as hard or harder than the fermentation. So a lot of it is getting a lot of these startups to focus on, you have to scale the overall process. The example I like to give people is, think of it, if your child is a very good soccer player, is it more important for you to have them be the MVP of the team or for their team to win the championship? That's often what you have to pick. If you want them to be an individual star, it's often going to limit the overall success of the organization. You know, quite honestly, you'll find with these startups, they want to make fermentation the best they can, and usually that's defined by yield or something. And don't get me wrong, yield in fermentation is important, but it's very often as you push yield, you may get undesirable compounds that cause you recovery problems later. So it may not be in your best interest necessarily to run at what's seen as the most efficient fermentation state if you're looking at your overall process. Let's talk about facility design for a minute. This is probably one of the hardest concepts I've had for many to grasp, but I think it's very important. It's understanding fit purpose. Everyone comes from a different perspective. I told you I come predominantly out of specialty chemicals initially. Most of the people here I've seen seem to come out of pharmaceutical. I've worked with a lot of companies in food, and I'm going to talk about the differences, and what I like to emphasize is there is no right or wrong approach. They all approach things differently, and it's generally based on the economics. There are things you can do when you're making a pharma product for tens of thousands of dollars, you know, for a small amount, that you can't do when you're making things for a couple bucks a pound for a commodity. So this is a good example. I focus a lot on the fermentation just because that's what a lot of these technologies are based on. So let's talk about fermentation. This is a 300-liter Sartorius fermenter. If you go in the biotech industry, you'll see them everywhere. It's basically comes out of the pharma industry. So if you look at pharma and you look at fermentation, there is an expectation of a clean batch, meaning if I run a fermentation batch, I'm going to have my target compound and nothing else in there. That's a general expectation. I can tell you in industrial biotechnology, that's not generally the case. If you're using fermentation for industrial biotech, you may aspire to run clean batches, it's generally not your manufacturing standard. The thing I can tell you is, and my specialty is really scaling up and then building these plants, and I've built a lot of plants, the difference in cost between those two standards is often about a factor of 4. So it's not that people don't want to build it to pharma standards. When you're making an industrial chemical or a food product, you really can't generally afford to do it. Food, a lot of industrial biotech, as the previous speakers talked about it started kind of in biofuels and it's moved to chemicals. A lot of it's moved into food, and quite frankly, that's where I see a lot of the funding going these days. Specialty proteins and food products, proteins from non-dairy or from non-animal sources to replace meats and dairy products. It's a lot of the clients I'm working with now. Food is its own area. It's probably most similar to industrial biotech, but for those who have never done food and come out of chemicals or pharma, I often find it's a difficult transition. It's often much more of, at times, manual process, and it's more of a focus on keeping equipment clean. And frankly, it's a different set of federal standards. You're meeting the food standards, not other like FDA standards. So the important part here is to understand when you go in what the applicable standards are to you and make sure you're focused on meeting those applicable standards. Lesson 4, scale up. In industrial biotech, there is no substitute for a fully integrated pilot plant. I came out of the chemical industry where we made chemical products where we could model most things. You'd use Aspen or ChemCAD, and it was, you were doing a synthesis up front, and then you were doing a binary or tertiary recovery with some solvents. Pretty much most things were pure. I'm not saying those softwares are perfect, but they would be awful darn close. You'd then run a pilot plant just to verify what the model showed you, and you very often, you needed to run some pilot plant operations, but it was more verification. In industrial biotech, the problem is if you look at all the metabolic pathways and things, it is really not practical to model most processes. So you're generating most of your information from pilot operations. So the other thing that's very important, especially for people who haven't built a lot of facilities, is you talk about scaling up. A lot of startups want to focus on scaling up a unit operation, fermentation, clarification, drying, as opposed to the whole process. What makes sense for an individual unit operation doesn't always make sense for the overall process. So what will happen is, they'll look at each individual unit operation, they'll run them standalone, they'll get their numbers, and they'll mathematically average, saying, oh, we should be able to make our dimethyl-glop for X a pound. Well, that's scaling each unit operation, not having them run together. Not realizing, as you run these unit operations interdependent upon each other, that you're generally not going to be able to run each process at its maximum. Full integration is really the key. I've built plants where a month or two after startup, one example, plant ran great for a couple months. We hadn't really done the piloting we probably should have. Then it wasn't running very well, and as we dug in, we found we had a 100,000 gallon tank basically completely full of sludge because we didn't realize that we were going to have sludge drop out because we hadn't run it long enough. Other thing I see a lot where people will make aqueous, they'll run fermentation, they have to bring the water off, so they'll run it through multi-effect evaporators. Well, a lot of these fermentation processes will make low levels of organic acids that when you evaporate them off, they won't realize they're materials of constructions, and I've seen companies completely eat through a lot of their evaporator sections. Those are only things you learn in running a pilot. I realize pilots can be complicated and they can be costly, but it's a risk reward. The less you pilot, the more likely you're going to face issues when you get larger. And what I like to tell people is, when I'm talking industrial biotech, a cost of a pilot batch for fermentation might cost me $15,000 to run at a lab somewhere. Commercial scale fermentation can easily be $500,000 just in feedstock alone. So you really don't want to be running things for the first time at a commercial scale. This is the other one I think that when you get into industrial biotech that's often overlooked. Material handling is one of the hardest things to scale up, where you'll run a pilot and you'll see somebody putting stuff in a bucket and they can empty it twice a shift or something. When that bucket becomes 20,000 pounds a day at commercial scale, you can't do that. And sludges, semi-sludges, other materials, very often a lot of the biggest problems in the early biotech I saw at commercial scale, most of it was not the core technology or the biology. It was often material handling, so it is definitely one not to overlook. This is the other thing I think people need to understand going in. I don't say this to be negative, but this is reality. This is the number when I started at Monsanto 30 years ago, and I would work with our R&D staff. We were told 10% of what worked basically on the bench was commercially viable. That is, you scaled it up. The difficulties you'd have with material handling or selecting equipment or other items, only basically about 1 out of 10 of what works at bench level ends up being commercially viable. So you need to understand that going in. Not everything that works at the bench is going to scale up, and you need to do the best you can to triage what your best opportunities are. Integrating unit operations, my 5th lesson, standard unit operations. What I would like to say is standard unit operations are never standard. And the other thing I'll tell you is, unfortunately, this is one lesson I've learned more than once myself. I've convinced myself, oh, it's an RBD process. It's done all the time. My oil looks like this oil. It won't be that hard to integrate into our process. So what I tell people is, if you hear yourself saying it's done all the time, our stream's very similar to everything else in the industry, and it's low risk, and we don't really need to assign a lot of resources, what I would tell you is stop and reassess your thinking. Because what very often can happen, and I've worked at 3 or 4 companies, or for 3 or 4 companies that have made different oils, not from seed products, from algae and other things, and they'll look at the oil and say, oh, it's like seed oil, we should be able to use a traditional RBD process, and they'll build it and it doesn't work right. But if you think about it, the contaminants that are in standard seed oil, they don't have unfermented sugars. They don't have chlorides from open ponds growing algae. A lot of the contaminants that cause problems aren't there. Now, here's the best part. When they evaluate your feedstock, they won't look for those, because they've been doing oil seeds a certain way for 30 years, so they look for what they're used to seeing. So this is a way of saying, I'm not saying not to use standard unit operations, but just realize integrating them is going to be a little harder than people think at the beginning. 5th lesson, location, location, location. Having worked for about 10 years in industrial biotech, I've built a lot of facilities in the U.S. I've built facilities overseas. I spent over half of the year 2 years ago in Brazil doing a build out of a major biotech facility. What I will tell you is, if it's a first-of-a-kind facility, well, what I used to tell people is I'd always had a personal goal of building a first-of-a-kind facility in a foreign country. I've done that, and I don't need to do that again real soon. It was a lot harder than I thought, but not necessarily for the reasons you'd think. U.S. is almost always your lowest risk option. I'm talking for the first of a kind, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not saying you shouldn't consider building overseas. There's a lot of economic reasons to do it, but you should be cautious if it's your first of a kind facility, and there's reasons. First, being overseas is one thing, being rural is another thing. Where I've built facilities, generally they're in very rural agricultural areas, and it's very hard to get resources. During startup, I can tell you're going to have a major piece of equipment break, and you're going to have to machine some big part. It's inevitable. If you're in a foreign country, that could be a 16-hour drive to get to somebody who could do it. Last company I worked at, we did a demonstration plant in Peoria, Illinois. This was the center of the U.S. Midwest manufacturing. Biggest part I could ship out for machining, I had 3 shops within 5 miles. You get in foreign countries, and I will tell you, I've done a lot of work in the rural South. There are times you'll work in the very rural South, you'll be convinced maybe you're in a foreign country from an industrial perspective. So it's important not only to understand potentially what country you're in, but how rural. The other thing is, you're going to start up this plant, and you're going to want to send your best and brightest young fermentation engineer out to this rural area. They're not going to go. So that's the other thing I often see as they build these very rural plants is they can't get the staff they want to go and work at them. The other thing is they can't be managed remotely, and this is what I'm talking about with your key staff. And if you're choosing to build a facility, a major facility, wherever you build it, especially if you're a startup, and even if you're not, in my Monsanto days, it would have been the same way. I worked startup of new facilities. You're going to send a team of some of your best people for 6 months to go get that facility up and running. So if you choose to build a facility somewhere, you better make sure you understand who, and the people in your company understand there's going to be be a pretty significant commitment to be at that facility. I often see that as quite a surprise to many startup companies. Prepare for the worst. I don't want to be negative, but any startup's bad. First of a kind's even worse. And the reason I say this is usually what I'll tell my clients on staffing. You can't staff this with a couple engineers. You're going to need, a handful, because it's not going to be as easy as you think. The other thing is, for a lot of these facilities, as the startups get long and protracted, you're probably going to lose staff. If you have people who plan on going to South America or China for 3 months and they're there for 6, and you're going to end up getting some attrition. So you need to understand going in that you're going to need to have people that you can backfill. So regulatory, number 7. This is an item I like to talk about. Know what you need to do from day one. I unfortunately see companies get fairly far along on development of their technology and even potentially siting a plant, not really understanding the regulatory implications. And what I'm going to take, I'm really talking more about the biology side of regulation, not the traditional air, water, waste stuff. Does it pass? Is your organism, a lot of countries, Europe, South America, the ability to use GMO in your organism and what that means is different. There's seldom clear yes or no answers. It's usually kind of a risk reward of working with people who have done this before and having them advise you. And this is why I always point people, and I say up front, I don't do this work, so it's not like I'm trying to point work to myself, but get someone who's been through the process. This is where you need advice from a battle-tested veteran. There are no yes or no answers. When I have a process and say, hey, am I likely to get grass to make this product and sell it for food? They're not going to be able to tell you yes or no. They're going to say, well, people are eating similar materials, so yeah, it may only take you 6 months, or nobody's eaten anything like that, so it's probably going to be 18 months. That's some of the best money you're ever going to spend on a project, is getting good advice up front on regulatory. This is something else I like to point out. I used to teach regulatory classes. Do not assume regulations are intended to make sense. And the reason I say that is most regulations are, to some degree, an overreaction from a bad incident of some kind. So because of that, and I point this out because I deal with a lot of companies who have senior management who don't come from the chemical industry, and the answer I'll get is, oh, you must be interpreting it. That's a crazy interpretation. No, that's the case law. That's what our consultants are telling us. Don't try and use common sense on saying whether this is the way FDA or DOE or USDA interprets it. You got to go with your consultants and the case law. So it's often a mistake to go in assuming that these regulations are intended to make sense. The last 3 lessons I kind of summarized just for time reason. Financing, as I like to tell people, the tail does wag the dog. You need to understand your financing source up front. If I'm getting a government loan guarantee or I'm working with a large multinational corporation that's going to balance sheet fund it, the way that plant's going to be built is going to be dramatically different. Because if it's balance sheet funded, generally it's up to me and my partner to decide how we want to do things. If it's a federal loan guarantee or a bank funded, they're going to have independent engineers and other things that are going to want to weigh in on a lot of stuff, and the level of effort is generally going to be higher. Again, neither's right or wrong, but the timelines are generally going to be slower for bank funded projects, and you need to understand that up front. Facility startup. Facilities don't turn on like a light bulb. Every time I see these startup companies show their startup curve, or what's even worse is for the publicly traded one, the analysts, they'll announce this new plant's coming online, so you'll see revenue projections basically showing it going to 100% capacity within a month. Most commercial facilities I've seen in my 30 years, 6 months to 18 months probably to ramp up to, commercial scale production. I've seen ones in a couple months. I've seen ones take longer than 18 months, but there's often an unrealistic expectation, not always put out by the company, often by the financial analysts on what it's going to take to ramp up, but it's probably not going to be a couple of months. Plant operations, it's not grad school. The reason I point this out, so what makes a good startup is they want to innovate, they want to change, they're used to tweaking things in their pilot plant, they're used to doing all these great things, then they build this really expensive plant. People want to keep doing that. And in my last job, I managed both engineering and operations, and it was two different mindsets. Once you're in operation, mistakes can cost you $500,000 or $1 million a pop. You can't be discovering things at commercial scale. So it's often hard for these companies to change their mindset. They've been built on R&D, but now they have to be manufacturing. When I tell a lot of these CEOs, they'll always tell me, oh, we have to continue to innovate. And I say, great, there's a place for that. It's called a pilot plant. It's not at commercial scale. If you want to start tweaking things at commercial scale, don't be stunned if you have, $500,000 mistakes that are hitting your balance sheet. So again, sometimes people have to try that, but you need to keep your manufacturing operations separate from your discovery side. So other resources, I talked at the beginning, this presentation really came out of a lessons learned series I published about 6 months ago. It was in a fair amount of trade journals. I've actually, based on my last 10 years, really tried to publish a lot of materials to help a lot of early stage companies be more successful. For fundraising and other reasons, I think there just needs to be a higher success and hit rate as people build facilities. So I'm trying to get a lot more information out there, especially on the side of the business of what I do, which is the scale up and building commercial facilities. So there was a white paper, which is really this summary I've given you about the top 10 lessons learned. I also put a 4-part series out. It's on YouTube. I would like to tell you it's every bit as exciting as Netflix. It's not. But it's about 2 hours of content walking through the development phase of a project, from initial development through engineering, through procurement, through cost estimating, construction, and startup. And it gives a lot of the kind of how-to, and it's really frankly targeted at a lot of people who are going to be building facilities and need to understand the process but have never been through it before. It's at least enough to get people familiar with terminology and things like FEL1, FEL2, a lot of the industry terms that people need to understand. How cost estimates are generated. The biggest pushback I get from anybody, I don't care, I could give somebody a number of $10 for a plant, they're always going to want to know why it's not $5. So, but the other thing is, given your state of development, how accurate's that number? I'll give you a cost estimate for my dimethyl process of $30 million. Depending on your state of development, that may be plus 50, minus 25%, or if you've done all your engineering, it may be plus or minus 10%. It's very important for people to understand when they're making decisions what that level of accuracy is. Also, a white paper I put out on what makes scale-up of industrial biotechnology so difficult. And my last one, because you'll notice I talk about both technical and non-technical, I published one a couple weeks ago called Engineers Are From Mars, Business Developers Are From Venus. And this is after 10 years in industrial biotech, seeing how the technical and the business people view things often differently and how that can lead to problems if they don't align their thinking. If you're interested in any of these, they are at my website. I've also got a handful of them hard copy here, which give you the link and some of the printouts if you are interested. And with that, are there any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because publicly it's a great area. The state of Georgia had invest in something which is too much. How much is this going to take over the world?
I would say that, so the question was, he mentioned that where he went to school, the chemical engineering school, got renamed. I'll tell you about mine. I went to Washington State University, almost 30 years ago. Chemical engineering. Half the people went to Dow, half went to the chemical industry. Few would go to pulp and paper. That was it. About 10 years ago, they renamed it the biochemical and bioprocessing engineering. They renamed it. What was interesting, I went back and I talked there some. What happened the first 5 years was almost every graduate, it became the new pre-med degree. People were getting it and going on to med school. But I'll tell you, as they've built around bioeconomy, it's pretty significant. I would say my expectation is probably half the chemies coming out of school now are going to the biologic side. And the simple reason is, and as a consultant, people joke, but I always know where the money's flowing. I'm like a moth to a light. If you want to build commercial facilities, you go where the money's flowing. The money generally is flowing to biotech, and even within biotech, biofuels is pretty much not a lot of money flowing. Some in biochemicals, but there's a lot more in the food applications now. But definitely, you look at federal funding, Department of Energy, USDA, ton of money flowing, and that's really what drives a lot of these universities. So, especially, I can't speak as much to the West Coast, or excuse me, the East Coast, but almost all the West Coast state universities have very significant biologic engineering departments. I think there was a question over here. No? Other questions, thoughts? I'm not going to be like the last guy. I'm going to wait here uncomfortably till somebody asks something. Thank you very much.